He's actually waiting in the background. He is SG Anon. And before I bring him on, I just wanted to share his bio with you guys. So SG Anon is a father, a friend, a son, a child of God, a patriot for we the people of all creeds worldwide. Having awakened in 2010 to the extent of the evil behind the processed food and says drink industrial complex. Maybe it was supposed to say military. He has spent the last 14 years immersed in the concepts of espionage warfare, cross-domain insurgency, counterintelligence warfare, cyberspace analysis, signal intelligence, and more. Between the years of 2011 and 2013, he was actively involved in online DDoS attacks on certain well-known commercial and government websites. And while his studies have been unofficial and extracurricular, they inform his lens of the unusual world we have today. He is an avid chess player and enjoys great barbecue. With no further ado, let me bring on SGAnon. How you doing, brother?
Doing well. Thank you for having me here. Good to be here and meet your audience.
Likewise. Brother, the last few days have been extremely vital to the direction and the transition of power, as you know. Many of things have been happening from behind the scenes. And one of the things that I wanted to address was the fact that, a week, I don't know if you heard about this tweet by Brandon, but a week before the incident, apparently Brandon was caught posting on X something to the effect of, the debating, it's time to put Trump in the bullseye. Or enough with the debating. There we go. It's time to put Trump in the bullseye. I don't know if you had a chance to hear that tweet, but furthermore, the secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, who is very corrupt and part of the deep state, apparently was the one in charge of those compromised members of the Secret Service that didn't do anything ahead of time. 5 days, apparently, before the incident, Brandon restricted security protocol for felons. Well, that, go fish, go figure, right? And Tucker Carlson even has some audio that Biden was planning this with two governors in a motel room with Hunter. Oop, it's all right. Hopefully I don't catch that. Hunter also behind this plan, from what, according to Tucker. The Secret Service was obviously infiltrated. There was so much evidence of that. Having moved some of the crowd behind Trump seconds away, that video is circulating on the internet, and crouched down, of course, before the shot, and even suppressing the security sniper to fire on the shooter when he already was warned about his 3 minutes prior. So I believe that this was an unsuccessful act of treason, which was designed by the deep state to stop 45, 46, and soon to be 47, so that, of course, they can maintain power and cover up everything that they've been doing from behind the scenes, including the 9/11 truths, all the attempted assassinations, the Island files. I don't want to say his name, but you know what I mean, and other things. So far as what I guess I gathered is that the White Hats apparently knew that this event was coming. However, they allowed it to an extent, of course, with extreme measures, which was designed to awaken the people more to the deep state and get rid, of course, of the corruption, behind who's really running the show, and why members of the Secret Service and members that were in security during that day were compromised. Now, it is believed that Mayorkas has been the one authorizing the illegals to come into our country, and that was apparently Mayorkas who limited the amount of protection for 45, as I said earlier. This was an act of desperation, apparently, by the deep state. And again, just days after Brandon's terrible debate performance. In any case, what's been your perspective about the shooter, the so-called lone assassin? Of course, we know he was probably under mind control. We do know that the three-letter agency has always incorporated MK Ultra with sleeper cells. So how do you feel about all of this?
We're getting started with a pretty intense topic that's on everybody's minds and hearts right now. And the number one question that I'm getting from everyone is, how can we possibly say that patriots are in some sort of element of control and these types of events are occurring? And I want to step back and remind everybody out there that that's a perfectly logical and valid question to ask, but we have to examine the nature of espionage warfare at the very highest levels. And that's what we're witnessing right now happening and playing out in the public space worldwide, especially in the NATO and Western realms, the former Commonwealth realms. So figure North America and anyone under the purview of the Western central banking system. The military industrial complex has its feelers into the intelligence community, or rather the reverse is true. And then you have that same very large matrix, that same Hydra beast that we describe along in this journey, having a number of feelers into interagency bureaucracies that come down through the DOJ and our law enforcement institutions, the FBI, for example, various departments of the executive, such as the Health, Cabinet for Health and Family Services, or Health and Human Services, the NIH, all those sorts of things. The Secret Service is a similar agency that has similar issues at the very top, and all along in this process, you cannot move the needle forward until you're 100% certain that you're not going to be stabbed in the back. So what we've had happen here, in my estimation, and this is just from the observations and the digging I've done in the last 4 or 5 days, almost 5 days as a result of this event, is that we had some amount of knowledge that this event was going to occur. It was prophesied back in March. A number of very notable individuals have made logical conclusions and presented that to the audiences. Tucker Carlson even asked Trump directly about this at one point along the way, not that long ago. And Trump didn't outright reject the possibility either. He sort of hemmed and hawed at the question and then moved on. And so when we look at this and we say, well, how can we have some element of control here? The response to this particular event is what gets my attention. You had Secret Service that immediately ran up on the stage. Yes, you had some incompetence displayed by certain individuals, and that's worth highlighting and drawing out. That's part of, I think, why this event occurred in the way that it did. It did highlight those that were treasonous in the immediate orbit around President Trump. It did highlight those that were willing to allow an assassination to move forward as a tool of political intrigue, rather than a condemnable moment at all points in history, right? And that's one of the narratives we've seen even wrestled with in the public space. But the service ran up on stage. They immediately shielded President Trump. You saw bodies up there everywhere, arms up there everywhere. And you kept hearing on a microphone, "Let me get my shoes, let me get my shoes, let me get my shoes." And so the idea that the Secret Service then would also allow a presidential target in the scenario and in the circumstance, the situation that was occurring in the moment, would allow any sort of delay whatsoever from extricating that individual from the stage forcibly if necessary, gives me great pause. We saw Trump stand up and really what we could see from the cameras was just primarily a facial shot, but we had the fist in the air 3 times symbolically, fight, fight, fight. And then we saw President Trump being escorted slowly off stage, again, partially exposed. Now, you could make the case for, outright incompetence at some levels. And I think that that's absolutely true here, especially at the top. That's sort of the highlighting of how this situation has worked in our benefit. It has galvanized, it has highlighted those that are turncoats and also those that are just not cut out for the job, quite frankly, and have no business being in the job. But it also reeks of some sort of greater knowledge being had here about events at play. The fact that the FBI came out almost immediately and said that we can't get into the guy's phone. And also we know who it is, just by the way. And then we had photographs shared online from a number of very influential citizen journalists that have enormous followings on X and other platforms, with the FBI essentially washing the crime scene off the top of the roof. So again, this very much reeks, like you said, of an MK Ultra activated cell that was activated in a way that was, aberrant enough that it was controllable, but not so much that it was entirely preventable, because you're working with saboteurs in the ranks. And all in this process, as we move towards this, coming November in this presidential election, and this has been one of the basic understandings of this entire irregular warfare campaign that we've been under since really the days of the first Trump administration. We have to drag out all of the saboteurs and all of the risk assets that exist within our perimeter and within our ranks before we can move to the next stage. If we, for example, need to rely 100% on those within the Secret Service orbit around Trump, we now know who we can and cannot depend on for next phases. So this really is an event-driven operation. It really does require the free will of the people, but we have good evidence to show that that entity online that told us POTUS was 100% insulated was not kidding.
Right. Yeah. From what I understand, everything was already kind of, they foresaw this coming. So of course they had to take some measures in order to make sure that, they were unsuccessful. Now, based on the turning point now, apparently this is gaining POTUS, I can't even say his name, but it's gaining him more momentum, more acceptance by those that were against him. Do you still think that we might see some sort of pre-election military activation, martial law take place, or do you think it's going to go down to the point where he will be, we're going to have to wait till November for anything to happen? What's your opinion on that?
Legitimately, I think it could go both directions. And in fact, as crazy as this sounds, I think both could end up being true. Throughout this process, we've got holdovers from administrations that have, enacted various parts of the U.S. Code in days past that essentially suspended the Bill of Rights. Executive Order 13224 is one such example, signed 9/23/01, and that was from the 43rd administration in response to the terrorist events of just a few days prior to that. But it leveraged a couple of different areas of U.S. Code. I believe it was 50 U.S.C. Section 1701 and the 1973 War Powers Resolution Act. And what that essentially did was place the United States of America into a unilateral military rule situation with the commander-in-chief acting as all three branches of government under a national emergency. And this was enacted again by lawful U.S. code put in through the corporate government during the 1970s. And so this was an orderly process of events that occurred where the military, from a lawful sense, really did have to comply to a great degree. We weren't at the point of overthrow of our nation, just yet. But we've gone along in this process, and we've seen a number of different actions taken by the 44th administration and the 45th administration, all along the same flavor, primarily using this commander-in-chief role to extend into the administration of the civilian executive, the civilian component of what the presidency is supposed to be all about. And under 45, we saw a number of those events sort of converge in U.S. law to allow for the expansion of what we would call military jurisdiction. In other words, authority to operate domestically. And there's places that people can go under Title 10 USC and a number of different places. I think Title 15 is also involved in this, where you can see that certain orders that apply directly to positioning, recalling and recruitment and personnel organization for the U.S. Armed Forces, the last orders entered are actually those of the 45th president, even though we've seen actions taken by the 46th ostensibly since then. So between now and November, some of these things have to converge. Some of this has to come out into the open and into the light. We've witnessed a pretty powerful buildup towards this health event 2.0 situation that may be brewing out there. We've witnessed a very powerful buildup with respect to the ratcheting up of certain agencies and organizations and their interests with removing other people from the game board. Right. We've seen a preparation now to exit one very old man from the race and potentially introduce someone who's extremely disliked. And Columbia University gave us a pretty good hint of who that might be on their official YouTube channel on a video that was published, I believe it was 9/23/2023, which discussed who potentially may be coming into the fore as the next batter. So throughout this process, we're going to achieve, I think, a high pressure situation in the United States, I don't believe that you're going to see large-scale civil unrest. I do believe that very small isolated pockets are probable in this process. And Trump told us, an individual told us on the 9th of June, 2024, that we hope that a certain group, how best to say it, demonstrates their displeasure at the time of ballot casting. And so with that in mind, we sort of have a time frame of where if you're on the opposing side of humanity, you really do have to begin deploying whatever assets you might have left, whatever strategies that you've got concocting in the background. You may be at a point of no return where your risk and reward ratio no longer matters because you're going to lose the baton at the end of the process. And I would imagine as a result of some of that, we're going to enter into that expanded jurisdiction operational phase, probably moving into the election season, and certainly with that November date.
Right. So what do you think about his VP? Was that surprising, or do you think that is just part of the script when in essence perhaps JFK Jr. will still eventually emerge as his VP? What are your thoughts on that?
It's really interesting. This particular note ties back to that prophecy, and I can't remember for the life of me who the prophecy was given by, discussing a period of 2 presidents in the United States of America. And we all sort of, intuitively understand out there that that's kind of what we've been living patently here over the last few years. And so if that's true, it would also stand to reason that you would have 2 vice presidents or 2 sex states or 2 ministers of war, for example. I would imagine that some of these positions are mirrored in the background as part of a broader re-inhabitation operation that's occurring on the territory of what you would call the Republic. Now, that being said, with respect to the corporation pick, and when I say corporation, I'm not disparaging Mr. Vance at all. I'm talking about for the corporate election process, right? Because this is a bankrupt entity that we're currently pushing forward. It's kind of like being inside of a dead Trojan horse and then willing it forward by sheer force of man and sinew. And so I think that pick, it did surprise me just a little bit, but as I've chewed on it and as I've crunched on it, it makes a great deal of sense why. Not the least of which is that it's extremely possible a 2.0 situation is actually at play. We have a reported height, an accurate height of 5'7". And when we see pictures at the Republican National Convention, him and Mr. T are essentially nose to nose. And we know that 45 is 6'3". So that's a difference of 8-9 inches almost. It would be very noticeable. And it didn't look like we had shoe lifts going on, right? The pants seemed to flow crisply. There was no interruption in the fold down the side of the pant leg. So it's very possible that's at play. Even if that's not in play, though, why would we still find benefit with this? Well, we have to remember that during the week after the installation of the Manchurian in 2021, we saw remarkable events recorded by EarthCam in the lawn of the White House gardens, right? And essentially what that was, if we go back and look at those videos, were halogen lights being placed up in a nighttime setting, and a large processing setup or apparatus, an infrastructure really built there right in front of the White House to process large groups of people with very large vans there on site. So if we acknowledge then that it's very possible a great deal of individuals within the government right now have greater knowledge of a broader role that they're playing or broader parts that they need to operate with or within to make this corporation essentially fall under its own weight and under its own sort of Jabba the Hutt style usury, I could see someone like Vance, fitting that profile. Very well equipped with the law background, also proximal to the mRNA agenda, the vaccine and pharmacological agenda, proximal to a company called Ambrosia, which we don't have a lot of time to get into that on YouTube today, but for those out there, you should go and look that up. Someone that may have significant knowledge about financial corruption, someone who has demonstrated an unwillingness, pretty much a unilateral unwillingness to not fund events overseas with respect to conflicts, to take care of U.S. finance first. And it's not been that long ago As a matter of fact, just a few days ago, I believe that Jerome Powell was questioned under congressional oath about elimination of the Federal Reserve, and actually responded in an affirmative manner when the question was posed as that being an option for restoring economic stability. So that was very surprising in and of itself, and sort of highlights again this movement away from a controlled financial underpinning and more to a sovereign financial underpinning. And so someone like Vance would have the vice presidential capacity to oversee how that would transpire with the states, given the constitutional role that the vice president was always supposed to have. And you would need someone that has a clear understanding of interstate commerce and international finance to make that happen. So in a lot of ways, I see this as an opportunity for us as Patriots and Anons to learn and grow. You know, there may be greater angles at play here that we don't fully understand. It doesn't look good on the surface. At the same time, we have to remember that there's lots of people that have been given the opportunity to have their, quote, strings cut. And so if you have the ability to fly freely, where will you fly and what side will you land on, right? That's the mercy part. That's the God part, I think, of the journey.
All right. Well, that's good to know. Now, do you think that once POTUS enters the White House once again, do you think immediately we're going to see some massive reformations regarding the transitioning into the gold standard and the collapse of the fiat system, or do you think that's going to still be playing out for another few months or possibly even for a year?
Legitimately, it would only be pure speculation on my end, and I want to preface that for the audience out there. But with the pace of the changes in various worldwide finance markets, not the least of which are Zimbabwe, Iraq, Turkey, and Japan, I would suspect that we see very significant events towards the North American system prior to November, potentially even events that would encourage what you could call a small scale, you know, crash down or a small scale collapse, and then a slowing of that momentum. And just very recently released hologram infused yen notes in an effort to stabilize the currency value and essentially eliminate currency manipulation inside their market, because the fiat system has really overinflated their economy, and they're under the same sort of debt bubble situation that we have here in North America. And that's a bubble that's going to pop when the military demand is placed on the Pacific theater of operations through the actions of Pyongyang and Beijing, and those actions are coming. So when that happens, I think we're going to see sort of a cascade effect from Japan over to the North American markets, probably almost immediately over to the Swiss markets and the European markets by extension. And how far that, you know, crashes down before we have some sort of pause implicated in the system, that's really anybody's guess, my friend. But it wouldn't take very long. We're talking about events that could all transpire within 36 hours. And so
that's what I heard.
What's so amazing about this process is that we are essentially, inflating the balloon on purpose worldwide, and we're positioning a great deal of the world. I think the greatest deal that we can manage to be completely disconnected from that balloon whenever it does pop. Iraq's moves back to the world trade arena, for example, they're coming. They're not codified yet, but meetings are happening this week towards that end. Ankara's accession into BRICS has been essentially rubber stamped. We're just waiting for final approval and funding into their central banks and their disconnection from the SWIFT financial system. That's significant because Turkey manages a very large standing army on behalf of NATO. And so in this process, we're witnessing essentially a NATO-funded power disconnecting from the hand that fed it, and very possibly utilizing that opportunity to turn around and bite that hand. And in this instance, that would actually turn out to be a good thing. I'm very excited economically for where we're going over the next few months. And I would suspect that the incoming administration is going to inherit a transitory period where we do arrive basically right at the outset of that new administration inauguration. I think we're going to have the implementation of a standard of currency as well.
Yeah, fair enough. Makes a lot of sense. So Nasera Gesera, some people are doubting these financial programs. I've always believed that that was the reason why the deep state back in September of 2001, or right before the incident, there is evidence, right, that the reason why they destroyed one of the towers was because there was all the evidence that they needed to reveal and expose the cabal to the world. What are your thoughts?
You know, my thoughts are that with the underpinning of um, that entire act, the Nasera Jacera associations and all of that, I think we had a very fundamental building block placed going all of the way back to the 1960s to show that that was an actual plan. That was a real background plan that was moving forward in the system. They attempted to essentially stop it with what they did to Reagan. They didn't end up stopping it. They just delayed it considerably. Once that individual left power and we saw the iron fist of the essentially what amounts to the NWO grab hold of that office of the U.S. executive and not let go until 45, just a few years ago. I think that they were attempting to delay the inevitable, right? We had a number of military generals, not just from the United States, but from most of the NATO countries that understood what was happening to their governments in the background, but were restricted by various things, not the least of which are the laws of war and the separation of powers within these nation states between civilian jurisdiction and military jurisdiction. And so they weren't able to lawfully step in. They wouldn't have the spiritual right and the mantle to do anything until it had all been moved sort of in a civilian fashion first. And we saw that happening throughout the 90s. The research shows that the U.S. Army was primarily involved in designing out and implementing that system. And at the same time, the U.S. intelligence community was designing an opposite system, essentially what amounted to a dark money system that was completely untraceable and which later became the cryptocurrency exchanges. So moving towards the events of late 2001, I can't say with 100% certainty that that's why we saw those events, but I can say that we saw a third building collapsed down into its footprint, no explanation. That happened to be the same building housing tremendous amounts of wealth. We have video footage. Granted, it's not very good, but it does go back to those days where we had vans actually recorded on the street outside of this building late in the evening, bearing DOJ markings, and who knows what was in them, both coming in and going out. And these evidently happened for a number of weeks leading up to the events, again, of the early fall. So bearing that in mind, it's very possible that we saw this pulled off because of the changes that were going to be implemented in the financial arena and the way that the financial system would operate here in the United States. It also makes a tremendous amount of sense why that same month we basically suspended the Constitution of the United States, which itself was a sort of an installation over and above the Constitution for our republic, going all of the way back to the early 1870s. So we moved forward then, I think, from that period in time as a patriotic alliance in the background, if we want to call it that, as a nebulous entity seeking to right this runaway train that was engulfing the world. And I think the re-strategizing post the events of 2001 really centered around the fact that everybody had to be awake and aware for this to work. And the only way that we could accomplish that and accomplish the kinetic changes that needed to occur was to expand the jurisdictional operational authority of certain forces out there where there was just simply no other way. It was too deep, it was too entrenched, and we needed a plug. We needed a way to make that happen in a way that was digestible and in line with the constitutional allocations for the redress of grievances and the replacement, if necessary, of government, right? And that goes back to our founding and framing documents. Jerome Corsi gave us a fantastic report in 2013 describing how he had been contacted by sources at the Pentagon who had confirmed to him that certain individuals had been contacted by U.S. military brass, both active and retired, and asked to be part of a much broader mission to revert the control of the Treasury and the control of the judiciary back to the civilian, we the people republic in that common law jurisdiction and remove and dissolve the corporate fiction that had overtaken the nation. And so we obviously had events play out from that day and time until now. And when we talk about Nasera Jacera, we have to remember that all of those things that were outlined in that list regarding the agencies and various taxation and various retrainings that have to occur within those that are representing us in a legal and lawful sense, right? All of that, instead of being overtly and very in your face, in a presentation fashion being implemented. We're now seeing it implemented softly, quietly, but very assuredly all over the world, right? Realignments of geopolitical diplomatic relations, governments that have never interacted with one another before, loaning one another very large amounts of money, implementation of a next generation financial reconciliation ledger, forcing the idea of a standard of value in currency exchange and in commercial interactions, period, worldwide. A retraining not only of the legal space, but also of the citizenry in civics and in constitutionalism and in understanding sovereignty and in understanding, the various forms of jurisdiction, right? All of these things are actually being accomplished. They're being rolled out right before us, but it is not so obvious as a news broadcast like was planned 23 years ago. I think we've been much more subtle, but I'm also very encouraged in the sense that the more that we get done in a covert and subtle manner, the greater and more rapid the transition will be at the public stage when we finally arrive there.
Thanks for sharing that. Now, we are at a very critical point. Do you think that this was their last effort, their last attempt, or do you think that the deep state might still have something else up their sleeve?
Well, with respect to the pathway that we're currently on and the journey barreling towards the election season, I think that we're actually going to see some more cards played. We've now played the ace card. Now come the joker cards, sort of as the saying goes in espionage warfare. And so we're going to see the jokers come into the play, right? We're going to see things that are so fantastic, so ridiculous publicly that they're going to, I think, surprise a lot of people out there, even individuals that are awake. But part of this, I think, is primarily aimed at, a couple of different things. One of those things is, of course, getting the consciousness of the American people to defragment and come back together and congeal as one, right? We have to have basic social understandings or this just doesn't work. But at the same time, we also are kinetically damaging the military intelligence and military mercenary complex that exists worldwide, has been primarily paid and funded through that fiat system that we were referencing a moment ago. And so with the elimination of more and more ground in that arena, that causes, I think, a ratcheting up of the pressure, because it really is for keeps. When you no longer have nation states that you can manipulate for your control, or paramilitary forces or transnational gangs that have military firepower at your command to cause major chaotic events or major destabilizations, then justice itself sort of looms right at the doorstep. And I think we're moving very much into that period of time now. We've seen cleanup efforts expanded on the ground in Central and let me make sure, Eastern Africa. Just in recent days, we've seen cleanup operations happening in the Philippines with a crackdown on drug crime there, which is very sort of uncharacteristic for the Philippines, because you have a lot of history there of talking a big game about that, but actually the individuals talking the game at the top of government are involved in facilitating the same. El Salvador has essentially been completely transformed in this period of time, right? And that was the home base for essentially what amounted to the origination of the MS-13 group, a very powerful and another large transnational gang capable of destabilization and causing large-scale urban unrest. So I'm at the end of the day, I say all of this to say that we're moving into a period of time where they're going to have to deploy some of these things, and they're going to have to activate some of these things, because they're losing ground kinetically throughout the rest of the world with respect to those. And I think that we're setting up a period of time here in the United States that Chris Miller told us not that long ago, where he said that you can use the forces of the United States military for law enforcement purposes, but only when civil society has broken down. In other words, there's no way for the civil authorities to respond to the growing unrest. And the key word is growing unrest, right? Not overt, not flagrant, not ignited unrest, but growing unrest. So in this process, Ismael, I think we're going to have a really incredible awakening as a people. I think that we're going to learn what it means to be American again, what it means to be free people again, and what it means to take control of our own minds, our own perspectives, and our own belief systems. At the end of the day, certain news groups and certain media organizations out there who have been for so long entrusted by the people to bring checks and balances to the seats and levers of power, there's going to be very serious questions asked and very serious consequences delivered.
Correct. And speaking of MS-13 and these gangs, these mafias that have been kind of pouring into our country through the southern border, we know that millions and millions upon perhaps trained assassins, who knows, sleeper cells are already here. And as a result of that, do you think that there might be some sort of civil unrest when 45 takes the White House, or 45, 46, soon to be 47?
I'm sorry, I was fidgeting with the microphone there. I apologize.
Okay.
I think that it's very possible that we see some of that activated either in the lead up to ballot casting, or sort of coinciding simultaneously with ballot casting. It really wouldn't surprise me if we saw activation of groups like the anti-group out there that everyone is very familiar with, in response to trying to prevent poll watching and honest reporting and citizen journalism of polling centers and things that are happening on the ground. It's really anybody's guess. This is such a game theory system, such a game theory situation of operation. It could go in 100 different directions. And I think that's the beauty of it in a lot of ways, is that we've maintained that potentiality. We've kept them on their toes to the point that they can no longer guess what we're going to do. And they continue to make disastrous moves, as evidenced by the choice 4 days ago. So, in this period of time going forward, I expect much more disastrous moves. I expect a considerable escalation of the pressure. I expect foreign assets to be activated here domestically in the United States and blamed very publicly and very overtly on certain Manchurian installations. And at the end of the day, we're really setting up, when we extract ourselves out to that 80,000 foot point of view, what we're really setting up here is the game board necessary to include certain globalist institutions that are fundamentally civilian in nature as legitimate military targets of the forces of the United States of America. And that's what we have to do in this process in order, I think, to unentrench those interests all of the way down in our society. They infiltrate our academia. They're involved in our charities and NGOs. They essentially fund and run most, if not all, of our think tanks. They're heavily involved in financing our academia and universities. They basically run our healthcare. So these are institutions at that very top of society in the world, over world government, if we want to call it that, coming out of that UN pulpit, that have to be made crosshair components before we can be gone on to the next phase. And I think 45, 46, and 47 is the one to do it.
Absolutely. I think we could all agree on that. Very interesting, my friend. So a little bit about yourself. I wanted to ask you some questions due to your background and what your skills are. So can you describe, I don't mean to go off subject here, but can you describe your awakening journey back in 2010? Like, what specific event or realization led you to uncover the truth about the processed food and all of the weaponization, you could say, attacks on humanity?
Well, it was really a God moment, and there's just no other way to describe it. I was in school at the time, and I had picked a research project surrounding cellular nutrition and the effects that various soft drinks had on the human anatomy at that cellular level. And I was researching I think it was a term paper. I was researching for the project somewhere in the middle of the semester, ran across a number of articles discussing food additives and their development, and how some food additives are selected for large scale distribution, others are selected for certain types of industries. And one of the ones that was being used by PepsiCo and Coca-Cola at the time, and was also present in Nestle products, although I'm not sure if that last one is still true today, was an additive called HEK293. Well, HEK293 stands for human embryonic kidney 293rd protein sequence derivative. And so it occurred to me that if we were utilizing the cell linings of aborted fetal kidney tissues as developments for taste receptors, or as guide stones for the development of certain flavor receptors and taste receptor components in food and bio research, essentially, that we would have to have source material constantly coming in to feed that kind of a demand. Because at the time, of course, this was 2010, PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, two of the most well-known, if not the most well-known drink distribution organizations on planet Earth. And so it very quickly occurred to me that the only thing capable of feeding that type of an apparatus with enough source material to maintain the research and the development of that additive was Roe versus Wade. Mm-hmm. And so understanding then that we had essentially a forced cannibalism complex hidden by the regulatory and judicial matrix of the corporate government of the United States that was co-opting our spiritual nature and forcing this upon us without our consent, it sent me on a pretty chaotic dark night of the soul, if I can be perfectly honest. I was very nearly expelled from university for making a pretty big scene with the presentation I put together. I was so proud of it. I thought I was going to convince them of the genius that I had discovered and the craziness of what it was really suggesting. But of course, I was relatively young. I think I was 19 or 20 at the time. And I learned a lot from that experience. And so I began to try and get involved in changing the world in the ways that I knew how. I was pretty geeky and good with a computer. I knew my way around HTML, and it was, the different versions of it that were coming out at the time. I forget the one that came out shortly after HTML. I didn't get involved in coding after that. I got involved into essentially what amounted to international forum boards. Not unlike those boards that later showed up in 2017, 18, and 19. Maybe not as organized per se, but just a lot of people that scoured various dark places of the internet and shared disgusting things that no one would believe, because at the end of the day, no one did believe you if you talked about those types of things publicly. And it was probably good that I didn't, because I imagine I would have made myself a target of an Obama drone if I had been too loud about it. So, with respect to that, it sort of informed what I wanted to do moving forward. I went through a period where I attempted to join the services of the United States. I wasn't able to complete that process, so I never claimed to be a veteran. But I did get a chance to meet a gentleman who passed early last year, a fantastic, amazing person, specialized in cyberspace analysis and analytics and just general intelligence digestion, and very well versed in the tenets of espionage warfare and cryptology and understanding how nonverbal messaging and signals communication works and all of those things. And so we developed a sort of a extracurricular friendship over the years. We weren't really super close from a social sense sort of way. He was about 10, 12 years my senior. So there was a bit of a generational gap, but it was a pleasant dynamic for a very long time. We met up a few times between 2013 and 2017 with the inauguration of 45. And, that's when I really began to devote myself more towards the civilian family man side of things. I never thought that I was going to see something like 45 coming into the fold. So I resigned myself to the fact that either we essentially had won with that particular installation, and we just needed to move forward from there as a people and unify again. And that's where we're at now, of course, in this day and in this time. Or it solidified in my head that we had been, sold out, and either way I was going to go and sort of live my life and do my thing. Fast forward. Go ahead.
We were sold out, and it wasn't just to the people that control the military-industrial complex. It was actually their alien overlords, and the person to thank for that is Truman.
Indeed. Yeah. We didn't actually win that war, and that's one of the things that I think we're going to learn going forward. And it's very interesting, the level of sellout that we have been dealing with in all of our agencies and institutions and governments. And so when I saw all of those events occur, and then I saw the administration between 2017 and 2020, and what seemed to be a reorientation of American society, and EO 13818, which was a very significant and extraordinarily important document, really only rivaled by 848, which was, again, I think a second extremely significant historic document. It occurred to me in those, in that period of time, watching these things occur, that we were riding the boat. And of course, everyone dialed in, I think, I shouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people out there that were paying attention digitally dialed into certain entities online that were dropping incredible amounts of information that was essentially blowing open the can of MK Ultra for the generations to come. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about my background, and it's just an incredible time to be here analyzing and digesting what amounts to a fundamental change in society. This is the end of an age of evil. We've never had the opportunity to do this as humanity before. We can reach hundreds of thousands of each other with the click of a button. Information is no longer throttled or controlled. This is a really special and exciting time to be here.
Yes, the best times ever to live on planet Earth, from what I understand. Unprecedented, they say. And so you've spent 14 years immersed in espionage warfare, counterintelligence, and more. How did you gain expertise in these areas, if you don't mind me asking? If you could share, if not, then we understand. And what resources or experiences were most influential in your learning?
Well, I want to preface and say that I'm probably not an expert in it. I'm, extracurricular studied, and I've read a tremendous amount of Tom Clancy novels, quite frankly. But one of the things that I think informs my lens pretty importantly, and that is something that I was taught by that gentleman I was referring to a moment ago, is that there's always a message that's not being communicated consciously, but it's there. Body language is a good example of this. And oftentimes we use body language in our day-to-day communications with each other and those close to us, and we may not even know that we do it. A certain eye cut or a certain, head nod, the movement of the hand on two sides of the face versus one side of the face, the positioning of eyebrows, fidgeting, these types of things. And that's just one small example. You could use, photonic communication. You can use waveband communication. You can use acoustic communication through rhythmic patterns. That's essentially what Morse code is. So understanding the world in that multi-dimensional way, I break every event down that comes across my consciousness. When I see the things that happen around us, I start wondering what is not being reported, or what's the other side of the public-facing coin. What's the other side of the narrative that's being claimed? Is it true? Is it false? Is it both? And sometimes it can be that. You can have truthful information dropped beneath a deceptive web. That's one of the ways that they've skirted this idea of karmic return for so long. With regards to the events that were pivotal in my development along in that process, some of the DDoS events that I were involved in involved encrypted communication with one another over what was then BlackBerry devices. So at the end of the day, learning that some of those characters would convey certain messages on the other side. If we had ciphers set up, we would use ciphers and practice those types of interpretive communication. It was always sort of indirect. Nobody would say anything truthful outright out in the open. You had to infer a lot. And sometimes those what we would call operations, they failed because individuals were not capable of interpreting the cipher or mastering the content in enough time needed to make sure that we could all communicate securely. So at the end of the day, and that again, that was at a period of time where I was deeply concerned that I was going to get Clintoned sometime in the middle of the night. And I want to highlight out there for the audience that I don't necessarily operate that way anymore, and I can't claim to. I'm sure there are heroes out there in our intelligence agencies that are for we the people that do operate in these fashions and are doing this even now, but that's not myself. But regardless, understanding the basis of irregular and unusual warfare means understanding the basis of irregular and unusual communication. You cannot wage an unconventional conflict unless you have unconventional ancillary considerations that have already been taken care of. Communications, logistics, transport, the movement of resources is really important, right? How can you co-opt, for example, a civilian supply chain to deliver military products on behalf of good individuals rather than bad individuals, right? And keep that out of the realm of public reporting, because that, of course, would destroy, I think, a great deal of the awakening component of this operation that we're underpinning and that we're trying to get out there into the community. So I know that's sort of a long answer, and I'm a little bit tangential in that, but that's an overview of how I came to the lens and the experience that I've had.
Well, thank you for answering. You mentioned something about cryptocurrency cryptocurrency being the alternative solution for the cabal. That does include Bitcoin as well, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And I can't speak to the current, situation. I really don't know, but I do know that Bitcoin itself was designed its initial intention and implementation was to allow for untraceable dark money to essentially pay off crime syndicates in what you would consider second and third world nations. It was fundamentally designed to underpin, dark transactions, what you would consider off book, things that needed to be untraceable. And it's my belief that that whole operation was actually forced into the light unintentionally through the Snowden drops and the Snowden leaks, because it caused so much more focus as a people and as a culture and as just a general conversation in the minds and hearts of we the people everywhere about what the digital surveillance space and the digital economic infrastructure that was emerging in the world, what it was actually capable of and who was pulling the strings and for what end. And that's not to sit here and say that, there weren't other things that were negative as a result of those implications. There's a certain entity online that's not really a fan of Snowden because of some of the compromises that did actually occur in addition to those informations. But one of the things that I don't think our deep state opponents calculated on or really saw coming was the fact that people would get so actively involved both mentally and emotionally in the idea of their privacy in this emerging digital age. And that really has underpinned, I think, a great deal of what happened with, JA just recently in reference to the release from Belmarsh in England and the return to Australia, right? That entire argument going back 13, 14, 15 years, I guess, almost at this point. And fundamentally, the basis of it was privacy. So, at the end of the day, I think that we saw a tremendous amount of pressure applied to the digital space, and we saw crypto forced out into the open. Whether or not it's been taken over, and repurposed for good intent, I really can't say, but I can't not say either, because we've seen 45 come out talking very recently about certain things. And we know that Mnuchin had some very interesting conversations with international business moguls that were heavily involved in digital investing.
Interesting. Makes a lot of sense, my friend. I've kind of always felt that cryptocurrency and Bitcoin was of the negative side from the beginning. That was my intuition, and you just confirmed it. Thank you so much. Now, do you happen to know Queen Romana? People ask me about her all the time.
I'm not familiar.
All right. Okay. I was just wondering, because I get that same question asked from my audience. Queen Romana. I did do a deep dive on her, and I was informed that she's actually an ET human walk-in. She's actually an extraterrestrial in human form. So apparently she's working with the Earth Alliance White Hat military. Now, what are your thoughts on artificial intelligence? And where do you think it's going?
My thoughts on artificial intelligence, I'm really fascinated that you asked this question, because I was just praying about this really not an hour before our broadcast. Artificial intelligence, from the best that I can see, and just from the information that I'm finding out there, it seems like we're allowing a great deal of infrastructure to be built out by the oligarchs that we're going to take back. It's sort of like allowing your enemy to build the fort before you go in with a special operations team and neutralize everybody that's inside. And now you have a great fort. I think the same attitude is being applied here. And I also happen to believe that you have individuals, patriots in trusted positions, as referenced by that famous entity online, who are fundamentally developing out a build-out network for the new economic landscape, and are attempting to do so in an ethical way. Really, what we have with AI is the world's largest and the world's first beta test at a global scale, at a worldwide scale. We're moving, all across different industries with robotics and AI. I've seen it in restaurants. I've seen it deployed in healthcare and manufacturing. I've seen it discussed for online purposes. Everybody's talking about the capability of AI with copywriting, with pictographic rendering and image creation and things like that. So we're fundamentally applying, I think, a sort of a litmus test of pressure to every major arena of society. How much can we handle? How much can we take with respect to this digital revolution that we're all sort of living through? And it's the same in the technological space as it is in the financial, right? And in the Great Awakening mental space, and in all of the different major worldwide arenas. I think the main thing to remember with AI, and something that I would caution everybody out there with, is to always acknowledge that with great power comes a great deal of responsibility that has to be leveraged. And we also have to acknowledge that with the advanced capabilities of AI, it's not going to be something that cannot, that we can take our eye off the ball with and expect to have no issues from it. We have to manage it accurately. We have to be, I think, actively involved in the development, the improvement, the refinement of it. And we have to transition whatever arenas and sectors of society are going to transition to a more automated approach. That has to be done with consideration for all of the wages that are being either lost or replaced, and all of the personnel out there that may find themselves needing retraining or repositioning throughout that public structure, right? But fundamentally, we're moving towards a quantum way of life, and that essentially amounts to being plugged into consciousness, the atomic power source of all that is, right, that comes forth from the ethers. That's really what we talk about when we talk about Tesla Tech and 369. We're talking about that power that comes from the spiritual nature of who we are. This earth has been given to us in rich abundance, and I think the AI development that we're living through right now is sort of the bricklaying of the pathway towards perfecting a more balanced relationship with one another, with nature, and also with the digital conveniences of a modern way of life.
Thank you for that perspective. Very interesting. Now, let's see. I do have some questions from the audience that have been trying to get your attention. Are you able to see the chat? Would you like to pick a question, or do you want me to pick one for you?
It might work a little bit better for you to pick because it's moving so quickly.
Let's see. Yeah, the deep state wants to hide their nefarious crimes, but they love to watch us like a hawk. All right, that was what somebody said. Let's see, what else? It is going pretty fast, my friend. I'll see if I can just pin one down really quick for you. But before I do, I have one more question. In your bio, you're a father, you're a husband, you're a man of God. Like, how do you balance everything out with the work that you do and your dedication to uncovering and fighting against global corruption and evil?
Honestly, my friend, I really don't know. That's got to be a God thing too. I get 5-6 hours of sleep, sometimes 4 hours of sleep, but I always wake up feeling pretty well rested. I always make sure to have at least 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes time in the morning that I can just get into a quiet space and try to really listen for what God's telling me. I'll put a prayer out there and then I'll try to quiet my mind. And that I find that invigorates me, and it helps me to focus. It gives me clarity. I have had, and I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not superhuman. I've had different points along the way that my boss and I have had discussions about, regressing workmanship quality and needing to refocus and redouble efforts on the private front or on the personal front. And those are things that I have to balance out. And it's sort of a never-ending juggle and a journey. But I'm fundamentally passionate about what I do. I'm really, really passionate about getting people across the awakening threshold to understand that we can revert this world back to what it was at one point in the past, where we were much more balanced. And we can actually, I think, do even better than that as we go forward with a much renewed vigor, because we're all connected now. This is a period of time where I'm, witnessing terminology, all of which I can't really mention on this particular platform, but it's becoming pseudo mainstream. It's becoming the topic of intellectual discussions at restaurants. I've heard grocery store clerks and gas station attendants discussing names of individuals that were on certain islands. It's very much a period of great awakening, of great resolve, of great determination on behalf of we the people collectively as a group. That's very exciting to me. And it sort of empowers me, I think, to help, with that balance that I was just talking about a moment ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for all the work that you do. I mean, you are truly an inspiration, just like Scott McKay, a true warrior. And the fact that you're able to balance it all out, being a father, being a husband, having a family, it's amazing. And you're a man of God. I like that you give a few minutes every morning to the higher power. That's what everybody should be doing, I hope. There was one question somebody asked. They wanted to know if you had any thoughts regarding any upcoming major event. I guess some people are still promoting the idea that there's going to be some sort of a sky event, some sort of a false flag event that is going to be not a good thing for humanity. What is your take on that? I believe that the scare event that people were predicting for the last few months was an unsuccessful event by the cabal, and that just happened a few days ago. But what's your perspective on any possible future false flag events or anything like that?
Well, one of the things to remember when we talk about breaking down events in our timeline is that there's a lot of different possible meanings to those, crumbs that were dropped out online. And that underpins what we were talking about a moment ago about, unusual communication. Mm-hmm. For example, when you talk about a sky event, you could have a weather event, you could have a holographic style event, and there's very, very advanced technology to allow for those types of things. There's also very, very advanced planning behind a lot of that goes back to Lockheed in the early 1960s and the design of particular narratives as a way to control the belief system directionality of the planet. And that's about as best as I can say on YouTube. We could also have things that fly through the sky. And we know that one of those things flew at 45 in 2018 and ended up with a Splash Fox 3 response, which of course was a desirable response. We have the Rocket Man in Pyongyang, who I think could stand to be poised at some point along in this process to enter in and, some sort of Joker card of a patriotic flavor, of a white hat flavor, if we want to call it that. That could also be classed as a sky event. We've got, this exchange that seems to be happening through all of the different major actors worldwide, this ratcheting up of things. The ATACMS event on the Crimean beach not that long ago was a huge escalation. People are not really talking about that, but that was a major, major escalation on behalf of the conflict that's brewing between powers in the West and powers in the East. And that I think we can expect a significant response to come as a result of that. And we still have events coming out of the Pacific, theater as to really reshape and fundamentally alter that system of finance and commerce exchange, and also purge territorial arenas that are playing host to tremendous amounts of evil right now. I could very well see a sky event being a combination of most of the above, where you could have a weather event coupled with a holographic event to provide some sort of Independence Day style cinema. And it was Stephen Greer, I believe, on the Sean Ryan show not that long ago, maybe a year ago now, that essentially said, yes, this is a playbook. This has been, in the works for a long time. It's very possible that we could see it. No one is coming out and saying we will see it, and I'm not confident enough to say that either. But I would not put it past the playbook that we have learned to read in the journey that we've been on, right? We've been given keys to the kingdom. We've been given eyes to see, but we still have to read the book, and we have to acknowledge that as of right now, we are still co-creative in writing that story.
Absolutely. That is so 100% correct. Nothing is set on paper. Everything is malleable. The future is plastic. We are co-creating it together through our choices every given moment in time. There is a question here from a super chat. What is the truth behind Project 2025? Have you ever heard of that?
Regrettably, the first I heard of that was the announcement from 45 on truth, and I've not had a chance to delve into it. And I hate that I can't provide any good clarity on the question, but it would just be really irresponsible because I don't know anything about them yet. I've not had a chance to dive in on them.
Mm-hmm. But what we could agree on is that the RV, the Sarah Gesera, the White Hat military, international army is getting really close to becoming implemented. Would you agree?
I think that I would say we're close to the opening salvo of the public justification needed for exactly that. We're moving into a really terse period of time. This is unprecedented. You know, this has never happened before. We've never had a presidential candidate, for example, survive an assassination attempt on the campaign trail. We've never had a presidential candidate so rhetorically oriented towards the destruction of certain institutions and influences that happen over and above the background in our government of these United States. We've never been in a position where the serpent dollar has been so vulnerable and has been essentially attacked on such a multi-dimensional coordinated level worldwide in such a short amount of time that the damage that's being done is essentially irreversible and unfixable. I would be very surprised if we, for example, if we went through the election season, didn't see any significant change and got all of the way to the end of the year with no major, and when I say major, I mean publicly overt and very obvious action, either on behalf of we the people or on behalf of entities acting in conjunction with we the people. I think that we're at the point where the pressure cooker is having a hard time keeping its lid on, and we're entering the period of valve explosions.
And that's exactly what happens when there is a transition of some kind between the old guard and a new system of power. It reaches a boiling point, and this is something that occurs periodically every 5,000 years. It is the shifting of the ages. Of course, in Christian terminology, we could say it as, you know, this is the precipice of the millennium rather. In Eastern metaphysics, they call it, you know, the emergence of the seventh golden age of enlightenment, which both equate some sort of a golden era where humanity is finally free from centralized governments, corruption, poison, and they are able to achieve and reach their full capacity and live under, you know, one brotherhood and sisterhood of mankind. Very exciting times, my friend. Is there anything else that you want to add to the conversation?
You know, actually, you sort of stole the words right out of my mouth, and that was a perfect way to close off. We're headed towards living under one sky as one mankind, each of us very proud of our culture groups and our national identities and what our heritages have to offer, but all of us also understanding that we are human beings under a living God, that this is our planet together where we're given charge over this earth, and we have to step back into our confidence and into our rightful place as his regents here in the world.
That is so amazing that you're able to say that and validate what my audience loves to hear the most, is the fact that it's not about gloom and doom. You know, some people believe that the world's going to end, that there's going to be a pole shift, that there's going to be Third World War, whatever, an alien invasion. And I always let people know that it's really just not. It's really about, you know, ending the end of the age of darkness so that we can begin the age of light here on earth, which is going to be you could say, what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to be marked by unconditional love and compassion, and most importantly, cooperation amongst one another. Is there anything else that you want to share before we end the chat today, or any other questions that you might want to answer that you see that is on the chat?
You know, I think the only thing that I would add is that when everyone wakes up tomorrow, try to take a couple of minutes, even if it's just 3 or 4 minutes during morning activities that have to occur in the restroom, and set the device aside. Exist just in that moment, in that time with God's Spirit, and really try to dial into what it means to be human being and what it means to be alive, right? We are incredible, powerful, interdimensional creations. We have enormous influence over the reality that is around us. We have enormous influence over the things that occur within and through our societies and in the lands that are underneath our purview and our authority. There's a reason that the greediest people in all of human history have been willing to spend wealth incalculable just to try and keep us from understanding who we are spiritually. There's a seriously powerful component, I think, to acknowledging that that's not a decision that they would have made lightly. And so it's, I think, incumbent upon all of us to really try and dial back into what that is.
Beautifully said, my friend. Beautifully said. And with that have said, where can people find you? Do you have a website? I know you're on Rumble. What is your Rumble channel? I could always plug it in the description.
I can be found in 3 places as of the present time. I'm on Truth at the handle Real SG Anon with a red check mark, REAL SG Anon. I can be found on X, formerly Twitter, at the handle THE News Patriot, and I can be found on Rumble at rumble.com/user/Q News Patriot, and I am not on Rumble by the name SG Anon.
Oh, okay, good to know. What I could do is place your links in the description after the show. That way people could find you as well, my friend. My friend, it was a great honor and pleasure having you here. You are very well articulate. You are extremely intelligent when it comes to the geopolitical and economical situation worldwide. This was an exciting show. We learned a lot from you today, and I honor your work, and I just want to thank you for everything that you do as well.
Thank you very much. The honor is mine. God bless.
God bless you, brother. We'll talk soon. And may the God force be with each and every single one of you guys. We'll see you guys Saturday night. I'm going to be here with Jenny Lee. Me and Jenny Lee are going to be doing a collaboration at 6 o'clock Pacific, 9 o'clock Eastern. So we'll see everybody else Saturday night at 6 o'clock Pacific time. May the God force be with each and every single